Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Review from Parrot TV. I am Dustin Pickering, your host. We have Carlo Parcelli and Billy Bob as co-hosts, and today, as last week, we have Peter Dale Scott on the show, and we're going to talk about Milosz and his memoir, with Peter's memoir from Milosz. So, Peter, would you like to start the show off with some lines from Milosz?
Yes, what really turned me on to Milosz was 3 lines from a poem I'm about to read. And I'll read the 3 lines first because I think they're kind of really, the question he asks is one which could have been addressed to a great deal of post-war American poetry, which was not doing what he wanted. So these are the 3 lines. What is poetry that does not save nations or people? The connivance with official lies, a song of drunkards whose throats will be cut in a moment. And then he says, a song, readings for sophomore girls. I wish he had just said readings for sophomores, but that's what he said. And I first saw this in Polish before it had been translated, and I said, I really want America to get this message. The whole poem it's just a page long, not very long. It was the introduction to his post-war book of poetry, and in it he's taking issue with many poets who, following Adam Mickiewicz, felt that it was glorious to die for their country. Poland kept dying for their country all through the 19th century. It never made any difference. And he felt that poetry had a higher mission. So here's the first poem, which begins, he's speaking to a particular poet who died on the barricades of the Home Army in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. You whom I could not save, listen to me. Try to understand this simple speech as I would be ashamed of another. I swear there is in me no wizardry of words. I speak to you with silence like a cloud or a tree. What strengthened me for you was lethal. You mixed up farewell to an epoch with the beginning of a new one. Inspiration of hatred with lyrical beauty, blind force with accomplished shape. Here is the valley of shallow Polish rivers and an immense bridge going into white fog. Here is a broken city, and the wind throws the screams of gulls on your grave while I am talking with you. What is poetry which does not save nations or people? The connivance with official lies, a song of drunkards whose throats will be cut in a moment, readings for sophomore girls. That I wanted good poetry without knowing it, that I discovered late its salutary aim. In this and only this, I find salvation. They used to pour millet on graves or poppy seeds to feed the dead who would come disguised as birds. I put this book here for you who once lived so that you should visit us no more.
All right.
So, as I say, this poem is full of allusions to the Polish situation, which may be hard for an American audience. But the big idea is that he wants Poles to stop thinking it's glorious to go out and get machine gunned to death in a futile uprising and to worry about deeper things.
So my question would be, how does that poem distinguish itself from protest poetry here in America? Say the collections that Carolyn Forche does, or something like that, which have absolutely no effect on U.S. foreign policy or the general population, and the notion that as you stated in your email to me, this somehow is a put down of Auden's statement that poetry makes nothing happen. I think Auden was correct given the context in which he was operating. And I think Miloš was partially correct in the context he was operating in, but he got an enormous boost from U.S. intelligence. And whereas Auden was not getting any such boost, he was being drained. And I think the same thing would exist with Carolyn Forche and her ilk in protest poetry, except it's so damn bourgeois that it really doesn't even merit the kind of attention from the intelligence community that someone like Auden did, for example. And I just want to what distinguishes Miloš's poetry from, say, stuff that that's done now in the protest poetry movement that is any different from other than the fact that Miloš was getting an enormous boost from U.S. intelligence and the whole context, the Nobel Prize, which has a kind of, for example, I told you that you couldn't win the Nobel Prize because of the content of your poetry, and I think that's true. Or but
anyway,
did you comment on that?
But you're collapsing time here. I saw this poem in Polish in 1961. We didn't have much protest poetry then. We did have two kinds of poetry. They called it the raw and the cooked. You had the very polished poetry of the academics in the East Coast. And then you had the beat poets who were a breath of fresh air. And we did certainly have Howell and so on. But Howell was, and by the way, I think Howell was very good for America. It made people ask questions which they wouldn't have otherwise asked. I think that it's an example of the kind of social poetry that Miloš was calling for. Forche, who I think may have been influenced by Miloš, came much later. The whole idea of poetry as witness, they often cite Miloš as an inspiration for that. But the biggest difference of all is that if you come from a country the size of Poland, there's no question, everybody knows that Poland has helped shape the history of that country because they had 2 centuries where they had no state, and Germany and Russia hoped if they made people learn German and Russian, they would forget about Polish. And Mickiewicz and there were 3 great poets. They kept Polish alive as a concept, as a culture, and without their poets, the culture, I don't know where it would have been. Ukraine too now, for example. Ukraine has an identity because they had, in the 19th century, a poet, Taras Shevchenko, who did the same thing, who just reminded Ukrainians that there is something to being Ukrainian. So it's very clear in a country that size, Canada, and not quite so clear, but we take our poets far more seriously in Canada as a way of holding Canada together than you can in America. America is many different cultures, and You can have a poet who means a lot for a culture. Bob Dylan is a good example. Well, I would say that Ginsberg, too, was another good example. Nina Simone, for Black poets, is a good example. But the idea that you could have a poet for the whole of America, the way Miłosz was a poet for the whole of Poland, that's very hard to conceive of. But I think that I see Miłosz's influence is growing, and you know, a number of American critics, quite famous ones like Helen Vendler and Bob Hass, have seen that Miłosz doesn't just have a message for Poland, he has a message for the world. And that's the point of my book, that I want the whole world to respond to poetry, because I think we're living in a far too prosaic a world. We're taking much too much guidance from social scientists and pollsters, and there's no inspiration. And what we need is the kind of inspiration that Miłosz gave to Poland. That's what I believe.
Peter, sorry, Carlo. I got one question. I mean, I was hoping Peter could contextualize the situation. I don't even know I forget what year that was in Poland. Can you just talk about the context of the situation in Poland when he was writing that, and tell me what year it was?
Well, yeah, I can tell you a year. It was 1945. It was the last year of the war. And he was writing it knowing two things. First of all, he knew the Germans were finished, that they would be out of the country soon. And he knew also that the Russians were coming in, and he had had experience with Russia. He had lived in Russia as a child, and had actually seen a Russian soldier who was a friend of his. He saw with blood on his hands from having killed another Russian. And he was certain that the Russians were going to be worse. So what he's writing here is not just a way of dealing with Germany. Germany was no longer the issue. He called himself a catastrophist, and there were a group of people who called themselves catastrophists. And they, all through the 30s, they knew that the decade was going to end in disaster. Poland was sandwiched between two expanding nations, Russia and Germany. And they wrote poetry which anticipated the catastrophe and also looked beyond it to say that there is hope. That was his enduring theme to Poles then. He wrote a long poem called The Essay on Morals, which was published under the post-war communist government, saying things are going to be bad, but you've got to hang together and stick to what you really believe in, because that's what will save the world in the end. And it's a good message, I think.
Carlo, you had, I interrupted you. What was your question? I'm sorry for doing that.
My question was that, so in a certain sense, what we're doing here is validating, at least as far as U.S. poetry is concerned, and William Carlos Williams' statement, it's difficult to get the news from poems, but men die miserably every day from what is to be found there. And so what you're basically doing, and Miłosz is doing, is insisting that within poetry there is a life-changing sort of experience that that would be of benefit to the world. So
yes, and that and it gives you not only truth but the energy to pursue it. Carlo, you and I are old enough to remember the anti-war movement in the 60s, and I don't know about the rest of the people here, but we had Joan Baez, we had Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan could say in a few lines of talking about, what is a man, quote that for me.
What's that?
How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man? So you would say, what's that about? but we knew what it was about. That the answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. It's pure poetry, but it inspired people who were out marching and about to be tear gassed and have eggs and rocks thrown at them, as I did.
But my problem with that is if Dylan was published by Columbia Records. Now I was in the record industry sort of at that time, and I would go to meetings where the Dylan album, the releases were discussed, and they were discussed in totally commercial terms, and then that Dylan was already subsumed within the capitalist marketplace. That's where he was coming out of. So I know it seems to be counterintuitive, but to a large extent, he was validating the notion that we had an open society, if I can use Karl Popper's stupid phrase, an open society by just simply being there and being able to express what he wanted to express. But from my point of view, coming out of a working class background, I can see there were elements in that movement that would one day be the very people who now are supporting this kind of U.S. hegemony that have supported it, so that you get this kind of conflict between what you go to their garden party and they're playing Dylan, and they're maybe even Phil Oakes, not Phil Oakes largely, but Joan Baez, of course, but at the same time, they're basically destroying the world, and then there's no internal conflict with them between doing that. I mean, they can absorb it. Anything. I mean, they might draw the line at Country Joe and the Fishes, fixing the die. Hello, all you big strong men. Uncle Sam has got himself in a jam again in Vietnam, and that song. But with the Dylan songs and the Baez songs and all the other people, I think Phil Oakes was probably left out because he was a Maoist. But they even though he had A&M as his publishing, I mean they saw money in him. There's this essential conflict that ultimately makes Dylan ineffectual. He's an ineffectual as Forche's anthologies are. They don't change anything, and ultimately Auden is more correct than Milos when it comes to the Western Empire in the United States.
Okay, Carlos, you give me a lot to respond to there. And there are three big issues I want to pick up, but I'll start with the last one. And that is, yes, when poetry has an influence, it's not going to influence the next election. You can't jump straight from the poem to a matter of whether America should support Ukraine or not. It works indirectly. It takes decades. It seeps through influencing readers of poetry and then the students of those readers. It takes a generation perhaps to really change things. And then they're not all going to end up agreeing with Carlo Parcelli. You've got to accept that there are many different points of views. And I have to accept myself, you may disagree, that sometimes good poetry is written by people whose views I violently disagree with, but that enlarges, the human mind has so many needs and needs a kind of breadth that it's good to be living with people you don't agree with. There have been attempts in the last century to set up cultures where everyone believes the same things, and those have, I think, been pretty disastrous attempts. So that's the first thing I want you to take issue with, and I don't want to go on too long, so if you want to debate that, but I have something else I want to say too.
Well, let me just say that I disagree with that entirely, because that's a very xenophobic point of view. I mean, let's face it, U.S. foreign policy is killing millions of people around the globe. We just had WMD down the road in Iraq. And now we've got this Ukraine situation, which is obviously another U.S. sponsored, NATO sponsored setup to get the Russians in, to respond, and they've done it. They've done it. Depending on how cynical you are, the U.S. has done it brilliantly. They're killing. The killing continues to go on. So within the context of the United States, those people who like Dylan, they're all the virtue signaling fools now, who can't see past. They don't know about the Maidan coup of 2014. I deal with them every day. They don't know any of this stuff. They don't know about the burning of 50 people in Odessa. They don't know about the eight years of bombing in the Donbass. They don't know this stuff. And Dylan and the Dylans of the world are not going to provide it. I don't care how much detail he puts into his poem. They're not going to get the news.
I'm not quite sure what you're saying.
They're not going to get the news from poetry. They're going to get a sentimentalized version of what the establishment wants them to hear, and that's what they're hearing, and that's really what they get through popular music like Dylan and Baez and all these other people. That's what it may have more meaning for Dylan. It may have more impact for Baez, but that's not what the people are hearing, because we come down the road, they swallow WMD, they swallow Iran Contra, they swallow,
I don't know what you're really saying.
Now.
Are you saying that if people read your poetry instead of Bob Dylan's, listening to Bob Dylan, that then Americans will stop what's happening in Ukraine? I don't think that's not the test to give to poetry. Poetry does influence things. Wordsworth, for example, completely changed the British culture and their attitude towards nature and their attitude towards children. It didn't stop England from fighting on the continent and becoming an empire and so on. There's a limit to what poetry can do. And I think you're castigating Dylan for things which are the limits of poetry itself.
Well, I don't know how you can say that about England. In Victorian England, there was a woman named Amelia Dyer. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she was the greatest serial killer of all time. And because in London at the time, there were so many young women that when they had children, they had babies out of wedlock, usually prostitutes, they couldn't support them. So they would go to this Amelia Dyer and they'd pay her £5 or £10, and she would promise to take care of the children. But she killed the children. Now, for me, I wrote a poem about Amelia Dyer, and I compared her to the British Empire, which was killing millions of children around the world. And so the best line of the poem is, "You might as well hang me from the flagpole as from the gallows," because she was emblematic of England in the Victorian era. This is after Wordsworth. He'd already passed on. The Irish called the Union Jack the butcher's apron for England's attitude toward the Irish, and that phrase was coined in the late 19th century. The butcher's apron.
We all know, Carlos, that this world is full of incredible suffering, and it's true that poetry has not managed to get rid of that suffering. I don't mean it has managed to accomplish something, I believe. If we want to take a larger view now, you go back to the 19th century, let's say that if we had not had the Bible, if we had not had Virgil, if we had not had the Gospels, these are all, I regard the Bible as great poetry. Isaiah and Jeremiah, these prophets, they were remarkable poets. And they're talking about, you go why do you go to the temple and sacrifice when you should be feeding the hungry and so on. These things have helped change the history of the world. The culture we have is a fallible culture. There's a lot that needs to be changed. But I heard Herbert Marcuse, I met him just once. And it was in a room where there were only 11 people there. And he's saying, we have to start fresh. Everything is corrupt. Even the words we use are corrupt. We're going to even have to start with a fresh language. Well, that's a little bit, I think, what Mao tried to do with the Cultural Revolution. And instead of getting better things, you lost the little bit of good that you already had. And China realized that the Cultural Revolution, I have to say it excited me at the time. I loved the idea that I felt the need to start fresh. But the examples of the Soviet Union and of the Cultural Revolution, or Cambodia in the 1990s, so they figured we got to start fresh, so we have to kill off all the doctors, everyone who has a university education. And the result was just total chaos and mass killing. And that's not, I think we have to accept that culture has something good to give us, and culture is renewed by poetry. And that's what I focus on. I have two books not published. One is History of Miłosz and my experiences with Miłosz, but I also have another book which is really looking at how culture has evolved through the centuries. I couldn't begin to summarize it here. It's a very complicated story, but poetry has been very important in the evolution of our culture. And we should, just because there's so much that's wrong, we should still resist the temptation to say that the culture we have has nothing to give us that's right, because it does. And America, by the way, which is, as you say, the greatest source of war and the arms trade, and I could go on and on. Well, all my books, my prose books, have been about what's wrong about America. But the American Revolution was a good revolution that it got rid of the idea that you need a king, and you said you swore allegiance not to a king, but to a piece of paper, to the Constitution. That is a radical idea that we don't even think about now, and we should be thinking about, because we're not really, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I don't think that's very much visible in American policy these days. There's a certain amount of citing of it. They say that we're in Ukraine because we believe in democracy. I don't think so. But that's, I don't want to get down into the politics now. I just want to say that there is something good in our culture. And by the way, Walt Whitman, I think, was somebody who did something to democratize that culture. And Emerson was smart enough to see it and made sure that that was why Whitman was so influential in his lifetime. Poets sometimes have to wait.
We're going to take a brief break, but we'll be right back with the Foreign Policy Review. Do you know?
That was quick, Dustin.
Do you know? Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Review. Now, I had a question for Peter, and kind of comes down to the phrase that Milosz used in his Nobel address, where he says, I wrote down the quote, "Speech feeding on itself." And my question would be, and he puts this in contrast or in comparison with totalitarianism, and do you think that creative language, sans social observation, can still challenge the state, can still influence the political realm, just creative language in and of itself?
Yes. Of course, when you say challenge, it's easy to challenge. It's not so easy to make your challenge count for anything. But Milosz also said in that Nobel Prize address, and I use it as an epigraph for my book, that poets not only anticipate the future, but help make it happen. That is obviously the belief he had, and they're doing it by a challenge. He's also, he's a very complicated man, and that's, I think, why he's a great poem. Most people, if they like a Polish poet, they're likely to take Zbigniew Herbert, which Milosz and Herbert became known in England and America because Milosz and I together did a book about him, and he's much more straightforward. Milosz also said that you have to take a kind of perspective on things. You can't just run into the middle of a conflict. And his book of poems about the war, the whole book was called Ocalenie, which Milosz translated as rescue, but the more obvious meaning would have been salvation, which is the word that occurs in that poem I read, which was the introduction to that book. But at the core of that book are three poems that he's writing about his child, the farmhouse that he grew up in Lithuania. And it's a kind of idyll. It's geese and calm, beautiful, and there are a couple of threats, like a rainstorm, and then the child is frightened and he says, "Has God forgotten us?" And in this perspective of childhood, he's raising the issues that worried people as adults in the midst of the war, because certainly the idea, "Has God forgotten us?" is what the Jews worried about in the ghetto when they were being annihilated, and what the Poles were worried about when they were being rounded up all over the place. And, horrible sufferings occurred during the war. Milosz is writing about a farmhouse in childhood. He felt that was necessary to get the right kind of perspective on where we are, where we're going to be. And that's why I can't give you a simple answer to your question, because the Nobel Prize speech it begins by talking about that need for perspective. And he says, nonetheless, quite revolutionary things about what poetry will be able to do. And it's not a very good answer. It was very long and not very tight, because it's not an easy question to answer.
Do you see that maybe in today's political instability in North America, specifically, post-Trump and the falling of our empire here in the United States, do you think that we could create similar poetry or a similar poet as Milosz?
Well, I would love to. I think it would have to be music. You can say what you like about Bob Dylan, but he united thousands of people. People would sing a Dylan song or a Joan Baez song, and they felt united. And if there could be someone who could see, by the way, I may shock you, but I feel part of me in the current divisions in America, and very definitely on the side who wants to, who's against those people who marched in. But I know that there's part of me deep down who would sort of like to march into a public building myself. And so I want to begin with the idea that poets should be looking for what is there that you could find that would unite these two factions that are fighting each other. I believe it's possible. I think I'm 93, so I don't think I'm the one at 93 to do it. But younger people, and you know, some of those people who marched into the thing, they were part of anti-war protests before. Their culture of protest was engendered on the left, even it ended up being used on the right. And I think that, first of all, validating the idea of protest, what is good about American culture is that protest is at the heart of it. It was born out of protest against the stamp tax and all the various taxes being levied on America by Britain. And that's why it has the potential to be a far greater culture, I think, than it is now, even though I think American culture has been an inspiration to Europe, European culture, even poets we don't think too much of, like Poe, for example, who never, quotes The Raven, nevermore. What is that a great poem? The French thought so. We admire Baudelaire because he's in French, but Baudelaire admired Poe. And the same is true of Emerson. We think he's a second-rate philosopher. No, Europeans it was a breath of fresh air for Europe. America was a breath of fresh air for the world. And now we're very stale there, and we're trying to impose things. We've lost, the people at the top have lost the vision that inspired America in the first place. And the only way you will get vision back at the top for it to begin to percolate at our level. And we're the kind of people who will read and listen to a great poet or singer if one comes along, and I hope they do. And I hope someone listening to this show will say, hey, that could be me, because yes, it could.
Mm-hmm. Well, this goes back probably about 30 years, but I saw a list of PhD dissertations for literature, and to top the list, of course, was Shakespeare. He's just for obvious reasons. But the number 2 was T.S. Eliot. Number 3 was Ezra Pound. None of those 3 gentlemen are exemplars of the United States. And what that suggested to me was, and at the time I was heavily steeped in Ezra Pound, was that,
and so was I.
That's right.
We both were interested in the fascist. And that's an example of what I mean. You can get great poetry from people with bad ideas.
So what that suggested to me is there's a whole deeper level, and then when you overtly interject politics within your poetry, that has a kind of diminishing quality, and of course the way Pound got around that in the cantos was that he had the 3 voices: Melopea, Panopea, and Logopea, and that made a very, very rich mosaic within the cantos. When I first read the cantos, it was a revelation to me that you could have a poem with history in it, but so elegantly derived. And playing different quotes off of each other, as though they were geological eras of different, and then suddenly taking an amount of time and playing them on top. Anyway, I don't want to get into that too much, but it was a whole different level of poetry than what I was accustomed to, and now we have a society in which everybody thinks they're a poet. At least from Dustin and our perspective, we see that all the time. We see thousands of
addicts.
I would like everyone to think they're a poet. I think that's good.
You think that's good?
Could you elaborate on
that?
More bad poetry gets written, but it's still better to have people going in looking inside themselves to what they really want to say. And I thought you ended up almost arguing against yourself, Carlo, because you're saying, is this bad that people want to write about Shakespeare and Eliot and Pound? I think there's so many theses because that's what people want to write about. And I'm not going to stop them. And yes, Eliot and Pound had bad politics, but I wrote my dissertation on Eliot because I wanted to, and I discounted the royalism and the so on. But I found a quotation which I still quote sometimes, and he says that the world is trying to make whole societies out of dissociated people who are not whole. And we are trying to create whole individuals in a society which is dissociated and not whole. And it may be that the problem of the reunification of the world and the reunification of the individual will turn out to be one and the same. I think that is a visionary insight, and I've more or less dedicated my life to trying to do it. Even though the man who said it said he was a royalist in politics, which I thought was kind of a joke, really. Turned out it wasn't true because they had the abdication in England and people wanted him to side with Edward VIII, and he wouldn't do it because he said, no.
Yeah. I very much admire scholarship and make tremendous use of it in my own work. And the Eliot line that sticks with me is so much as humankind cannot stand too much reality.
Yes, that's very good.
And
birth and population and death, that's all the facts when you come to brass tacks. There's an awful lot of Eliot that's very quotable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I kind of lost my train of thought because but yes, so you feel that everyone writing poetry is a good I mean, maybe you don't run in the same circles I do.
I'm not saying they write good poetry. I said it's good for them to write poetry. That's quite a different statement.
I'm not convinced it's really
if they write poetry, they're less likely to shoot their grandmother, as somebody just did last week.
Well, I disagree with that.
Or if they were anticipating that, they would probably be, as the shooter at Virginia State was a Nikki Giovanni. He actually reported that shooter to the school administration before he did his shooting. Based on his writing alone, she said he was very disturbed. And if somebody were writing poetry that was disturbed, we can at least recognize it and say, okay, let's address this. Let's see what the problem is.
You see, a failure in communication is the source of so many problems.
Right.
And if somebody is writing stuff that is clearly an indication that he's going to explode, for it not to get through is a failure in communication. Poetry increases communication. And I think that it also gets people to levels that schools don't deal with. Schools are teaching you that 9 times 9 is 81. There's a lot that the schools don't do and that the schools can't do that needs to be done. And I'm not saying that poetry is going to solve all these problems, but I'm saying if you have a culture where poetry is not taken seriously, and I would say that is the culture we're in pretty much. We buy the poets off, we give them prizes, we give them classrooms, but we don't take poetry seriously. And someday we'll maybe take it more seriously. It's been taken more seriously in the past, I might say.
I just see it as a form of I use the term again, bourgeois reinforcement. People who don't.
The bourgeois will use it to reinforce, yes, but the poem doesn't say, "Here I am, I'm bourgeois, exploit me." No,
well, yes, it does in a way. I mean, people who don't know anything about poetry and have never read any other poet will they'll insist that they have a place within the poetry world because they've written one poem. And I have firsthand experience with this because I am a member of the National International Beat Poetry Society or Foundation. And
Good.
one of my tasks, I can ignore it if I want to, is to go and listen to these people in these anthologies read their poems who know nothing about poetry. It's in many cases they're reading the only poem they ever wrote, and they don't know who T.S. Eliot is. They when I could get into an anecdote about the collected Eliot and the Broadway show Cats. Briefly, Cats came out. Many people saw the Broadway show or were enamored by his, book of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. So they went to the Broadway musical. So they bought the collected Eliot that had been around for a long time. And then when they started to read what Eliot was really like, they gave it up as a used book. So I used to buy every copy I could. I would see dozens of copies of it and buy it and sell it at a minimum price, resell it at a minimum price because it's great poetry. But they had bought it. They read what he was really like. The Wasteland, come on, the Four Quartets, and they had wanted nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it.
Well, I think you changed your tone from at least the last show, because I thought you thought the people who won Nobel Prizes were just part of the establishment, and Eliot was certainly part of the establishment, and yet you're quite interested in him, and I'm glad you are, because I agree with you. He is a great poet, and that's, poetry baffles us that sometimes we're drawn to it for when part of our brain says we shouldn't be, and that is the case with Eliot, and even more with Pound, who was a racist and an anti-Semite. You could throw the whole book of charges against Pound, and they would be true. But he was a great poet who went insane, unfortunately. But that would be a whole other issue. I did have one other issue I wanted to raise with you, Carlo, because you were talking about Dylan as if he was getting these, backed by Columbia, and Miłosz, who at one point worked with the CIA. And I wanted to assure you, first of all, about Miłosz, that he became famous in Poland with no institutional backing at all, because actually everything was underground. It was underground during the Nazis, and very soon his poetry was underground under the communists as well. With Samizdat, people would copy it out and they would print it off in an illicit mimeograph machine. And that was the hardcore of the intellectual support for Solidarity. The Solidarity movement was people who were sharing bootleg copies of Miłosz, and they knew they could trust each other, because if somebody knew Miłosz, then you knew that they weren't just an informant who had been penetrated the regime, because you really had to believe in Miłosz to understand him and to be able to quote him. So it's the poems themselves. It isn't the fact that Dylan was with Columbia Records. It's that he wrote songs that people loved. They weren't loving them because they were easy to get. He started, what was it? It was at the folk festival in Newport in 1954 or something. It was goes back. It was way before the war, and he was just an instant success. I think Joan Baez introduced him and said, listen to this guy, and they listened to him and went crazy over him because he had the right kind of appeal.
I believe,
and he got a Nobel Prize. So he's establishment too, definitely, but he deserved that Nobel.
Let me just briefly point out, Eliot won the Nobel Prize for the cocktail party.
No, you win the prize. You don't win it for, you just win it.
Yeah, but it was the cocktail party that put him over the top. That's just in the history of the prize. and his relationship to it. Secondly, James Joyce never won the Nobel Prize. For me, that pretty much says it all. That's another level of gatekeeping. That's just another level of gatekeeping. But and protecting, giving a safe cocoon to the powers that be. All one has to do is look at a list of the Nobel Prize winners in literature, and they're all safe people. Most of them have been long forgotten.
That's true. Most of them are not forgotten. Yeah, that is.
You wanted to say something, Dustin?
I just mentioned that I believe when we were talking about Bob Dylan, I thought, from my understanding, is Leonard Cohen's beginnings were kind of the same. He was just kind of put on stage, and it was like he was very shy at first, and he had to overcome stage fright, immense stage fright as he performed.
And Judy Collins, he pulled him out on the stage, and he started to sing, and then he lost his nerve and ran off stage, and she had to go and pull him back out. He said, "No, I completely screwed up." And she, "Come back out, and you'll see that you didn't." And he came back out, and the crowd went crazy for him. Yeah, that was Judy Collins.
And I'm sitting here thinking, this guy behind me, Lenny Bruce, he gave his life to open up language. They literally killed him. They deprived him of the ability to make a living. It's interesting you mentioned Cohen running off stage, because Bruce got a lot of his early material from a man named Joe Ansis that was afraid to go on stage, and Bruce at Hanson's Deli in New York used to sit there with Rodney Dangerfield and Buddy Hackett and all these guys, and Joe Anson would come in and crack them all up, and Lenny just would listen. He would listen, and he formed his act around Ansis, but it ultimately cost him his life, because that's where he got his sense of social criticism from. And I admire Bruce much more than I do any of these other people we've been talking about.
Really, more than Elliot and Pound.
Yes, more than Elliot and Pound.
And he's influenced your life more than Pound.
Yes, and earlier on, because I had not read a book until I was forced to go to college because of the draft. But I had listened to Lenny Bruce when I was in high school, and I had memorized Lenny Bruce routines. So when things got dull in Rudd Fleming's class, he would ask me to come up, and I would do Father Flatsky's Triumph. I would do Lenny Bruce routines. I would do the Palladium. That was poetry to me. And
I wonder who's torturing children back there. I hear a lot of weird noise.
Yeah, it makes for
That's a strange noise. I hear.
Can't stop it. It's happening.
But Billy Bob, you want to jump in here?
Well, I'm. It's an interesting conversation, and you guys' back and forth is riveting. I was going to ask him about, you mentioned that the U.S. intelligence had funded Miloš or supported Miloš. Yes. And then Peter said, Miloš helped keep the Polish culture alive.
Yes.
So I was going to ask Peter, what interest do you think the U.S. intelligence had in keeping Polish culture alive? Like, why would that be something they would be interested in doing? Do you think they just love Poles?
The CIA support began in 1952, or 51, when Miloš, after the war, he was a diplomat for the post-war government. He wanted to give the post-war government a shot, see if it would be able to be both communist and good for Poland. By 51, he was convinced. Then Stalinism really kicked in Poland in 49. He went back and he saw it was just terrible things there. And he was really shocked that people, they were frightened of him because he was warmly dressed, and most people were. That's a whole other story. Anyway, he joined a movement which was started independently of the CIA, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which wanted to tell people in Western Europe what things were like in Eastern Europe so that they wouldn't vote communist. So the CIA was very interested in seeing France and Italy not vote communist. And they gave money to them. That's all they did. They didn't tell the Congress what to say. Well, I have to qualify that a bit. They were following the canon line of containment. And there were some people who wanted them to advocate for the liberation of Eastern Europe, but the leadership of the Congress, and there were CIA people in the leadership, said, no, we'll just focus on saving Western Europe. And that's what the CIA, and that's what Miloš wanted to do. He wanted passionately for Western Europe not to have Stalinism come to Western Europe. And as I said, I think I said this last time, when I knew this when I first met him, and at first I forgave him for his CIA involvement, and then I came to accept it. And now, having rewritten my book for the first time, I really admire that. I think it was very costly to him because he was separated from his wife for 3 years, not voluntarily. America wouldn't let him back in because they said, no, you work for a communist government. The McCarran Act says we don't let those people in. There was room for exceptions, and there was an appeal. A lot of intellectuals said, let Miloš back in. But the security people, I've read his FBI file, and there were people saying he was a rabid communist. And even in 1960, he had written The Captive Mind and everything. The FBI circulated somebody saying that every one of Miloš's writings was serving the communist cause. It's a miracle he got to be at Berkeley at all. The local FBI office was appalled. But there are many cross currents in America, and that's to its credit, I guess. Though there are some of them pretty stupid.
Well,
it's been a really
U.S. intelligence paranoia.
Right. Well, I think we have about 2 minutes, so closing out. But thanks for joining us, Peter and Carlo and Billy Bob. Thank you, also for being on the program and, as usual, co-hosting. And hopefully next week we'll have a great guest. I know we have Scott Rader coming back on the 9th, I believe. So keep a lookout for that.
Tentatively. I haven't got him to say.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to. Hopefully we'll have it prepared, but we'll see if he's on here or not. So if you haven't subscribed to the Foreign Policy Review and subscribed to the Parrot TV's station, please do so now. And thanks for joining us and watching this program. And I hope you guys have an excellent day. Do some research. Do your own thing. Do some thinking.
Write your own poem.
Write your poetry. Challenge authority. Go out and enter some public buildings. I'm not going to advise that. Myself, I'm not.
Yeah, we didn't get around to the free speech movement and Miloš's attitude toward that.
Or Leonard Cohen, because I was, I knew Leonard Cohen when he was a junior.
Oh yeah, right, Canadians.
I love Leonard Cohen. He's one of my top favorites.
I have the Leonard Cohen ring, and if I go to the synagogue, I wear my yarmulke, one that Leonard gave to me just a couple of years before he died.
Oh, wonderful. Wow.
Okay. Well, for another time.
Yeah, we'll have a third part 3.
Talking more about all these different subjects, all the ones we've discussed.
It was great talking with you guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thanks.
Thanks to our viewers today. Subscribe to our channel, Foreign Policy Review. We'll talk to you again next Thursday, 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. And we'll go back to commercial. Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for for you as a writer. This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will